started on the web too old before React. And I was just like, this is insane to me that we can just accept that this is the only way. So I made benchmarks. I did tests. I looked at every example. I tried to see if I could build a system that was performant and ergonomic and had all the things that I liked. But more than that, actually having learned from stuff from React, like unidirectional flow, things that made apps more maintainable. You don't need React to hit these kind of problems when you're building apps.
Hello, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Noel, and today we have Ryan Carniato, creator of SolidJS, here to talk about a decade of SolidJS, a blog post he recently wrote. In this episode, Ryan and I talk about the history of Solid, the success on the heels of React hooks, and how signals may be the web primitive we all really need. So here's our episode with Ryan Carniato. Welcome back, Ryan. How's it going?
Hi. Glad to be back. It's definitely been a little while, but
yeah, like years, I think. I think it's been a couple years. I don't remember exactly what the context was last time we chatted, but
probably Solid Start. It was probably like just before Solid Start came out around that.
Right.
So just about a year. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. This blog post is an interesting one. It's kind of like a reflection on your journey and, Solid's path here and kind of your relationship with it and the framework community and open source in general and all this stuff. Why did you think now was kind of a good time to push this out and get this out there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to be fair, it hasn't quite been 10 years yet. It'll be 10 years like this summer, but it'd been exactly 7 years from when I open sourced the library. That's what got me thinking about it. Like, that's when not most people, but some people started becoming aware of Solid, but I'd started working on Solid before that. But 7 years still marks a long time. I remember sitting it was actually on my birthday earlier in the year in February, and realizing that it had almost been 7 years since I open sourced it. And it was like my birthday was the day that the gap between when I first open sourced Solid till present day was the same. Had finally exceeded the gap between when jQuery was released and React was released.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a long time in web development years.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah,
right. Because people picture jQuery and then they picture React, and there's like a whole era in between.
Mm-hmm.
And this year Solid's been around for that long. That gap.
Yeah, it's always like an interesting exercise personally, but yeah, I hadn't done this in like in the web tooling framework world, because you're right, like jQuery feels so much older than like React and that wave. It's interesting to think, like, do you think that there's this kind of slowing of the tool landscape at large is a like a product of kind of the maturing, the ecosystem maturing? Or do you think there's something like that kind of was really struck there with React that's kind of caused this era to be a little bit more stable?
Yeah, I think it's mostly a function of maturing, right? Like, there was a lot of stuff back when I was getting into this and, web development, and even like, getting into JavaScript. I spent some time on the back end after, like, in the early 2000s. When I got back into JavaScript around 2009, 2010, we had new libraries, new frameworks all the time. And even after React, the first few years, it was still very fast. I think just people naturally were looking for, something they could trust. The thing is, as applications and requirements get more, I'm not going to say just complicated, but like, just like the whole quality expectation goes up, you're going to want to expect more out of your tools, and you don't want to keep on shifting. It's just bigger projects, more at stake. It was kind of natural that things would slow down.
I don't find it super surprising either, I guess, but I do think it is interesting now, because I think that there was kind of a point where we were churning through things very quickly, and then something happened, and like now there are still several paths, but they seem to all kind of be running in parallel, and there's like still a big React community, there's a big Vue community, there's a big Svelte community, and there's a Solid community. Like, why do you think that these like kind of are all running with such steam behind them, when before it really felt like devs were kind of more eager to jump ship and like find a new thing to cling to.
I mean, part of it is that desire for maturity. I think what part of it came in too is like a lot more new web developers over time, and this continues to grow. And I think that like we saw a whole generation of people on the web whose entry point was at a different place. Like when I
Mm-hmm.
started, you know, way back, we had HTML. We had like no one. You kind of used JavaScript maybe for something novel, but you had
Mm-hmm.
like Perl scripts and CGI bins, and like you know, like it was kind of really rough. And you know, things, you know, you're kind of expected to put things together. I think there's been a whole generation, you know, since declarative frameworks where people came out, and React was that first introduction to the web.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you were going to pick a different solution, it's still going to kind of resemble that somewhat. Like you're just like, that's kind of the expectation. And then, you know, we went from that being like an app framework, right? React
Mm-hmm.
was built for apps. It was
Mm-hmm.
built for, you know, highly interactive things, to people going, okay, well, this is the web. How do I build my static site? And they're just like, I know React, and
Mm-hmm.
like it, you know, this kind of universality continued onwards. And I think that's kind of why, like, that's not why there's like camps per se, but that's part of that kind of slowdown, and where there's not that as much expectation on exploration, because like the baseline, the ground floor, the abstraction had already been set. People weren't really peeking under the hood anymore. That's why I think we went from that phase where it was a lot of different frameworks and stuff all
Mm-hmm.
through 2009 through 2000. I want to say 14, 15.
14 was going to be my number too. Yeah. Yep.
Right. Because
Yeah.
React came out in 2013. It did take a year or two after React for the completely cement over. But to like the focus of frameworks being on like different things, it's like instead of being like, oh, here's all my different, you know, I do things this way or these novel things, a real DX focus kind of shifted. Like
Mm-hmm.
the only new frameworks coming out after 2015, for at least the next 3 or 4 years, it felt like were ones that focused on a different developer experience. We offer something different than React because we have templates, or we have, you know, our HTML with our CSS, or what. Like
Yeah.
it was like very much a developer experience focus,
Mm-hmm.
just like the the vibes you get off it,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
Rich Harris would go later on to say. And I think that was because people didn't want to like think about something like too different. It was kind of like JavaScript fatigue came in, where people were like
Yeah.
tired of different libraries and stuff. By 2016, people were not interested in new frameworks anymore, really.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they continued to be built, and you know, a few of them were lucky enough to be successful.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the maturing had started. This whole kind of shift had happened, and frameworks started targeting like the entry funnel. They started looking at like, how do I get adoption? How do I get people to like, you know, look at this and want to use it?
Mm-hmm.
It was much. I mean, that's already a much more mature place. It's not just a bunch of people with the technology. It's like marketing.
Yeah, yeah. It's like that we hit an era where you could really like market at the dev experience, right? And like make it like target the developer to convince them. I feel like this is as good of kind of a framework, a foundation for our conversation as anything then. So stepping into this like whatever 7 and change years ago, what was like your main motivation to kind of and you know like what made you optimistic enough to kind of get this out in front of the world and open source it when everybody was so, you know, kind of entrenched in React?
I mean, at first I wasn't. It took me a long time. That's why I wrote like in this article. I'd been playing around with stuff like this 2015. I mean, for me, like I actually had tried to build some stuff with other framework tools and like use web components like back as far
Yeah.
as like 13, 14. So I spent a lot of time doing web component open source stuff, like nothing really popular, but I made a few libraries and did some stuff in my company I was working at the time. But like it was around 2015 when I realized that React had won. Like it was kind
Mm-hmm.
of obvious. And I was like, it wasn't about marketing or adoption kind of
Yeah.
things for me. I was like, I don't like this. I mean, I React is right. I had to like admit that there was a lot of mess in like Knockout, which was my favorite tool at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah. I was going to ask about Knockout. Yeah, yep.
Like, and no one was
Yeah.
updating it anymore.
Mhm.
Like it kind of died out. And I like, they were right. There was a lot of things that were unpredictable and magical, perhaps,
Yep.
which is hilarious by modern standards, because
Yeah.
everything is magical now by modern
Now
standards.
the level of magic we're okay with is much higher now than
Right.
it was then. Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought it was because for a while I thought it was yeah, I thought it's because people understood stuff more. I thought that we'd grown as a community and matured and understood our technology more, and the magic was gone, and that's why we could go to higher levels of abstraction. But sometimes these days, I actually think it's just like the expectation now is just that the magic is there, and I don't need to understand it.
Mm,
That it just all goes. It's
yeah.
like it's all good.
Mhm.
But for me, looking back at that time, I really was like, there's got to be another way. I remember I mentioned this in the article, but I watched some like performance benchmarks, especially one created by Ryan Florence. Many people know one of the co-creators of React Router and
Mhm.
Remix, and it was a performance demo around like diffing like a stock ticker, and I looked at this and I was like, no offense to Ryan, but I'm like, this is not a real app. Like it would
Yeah.
be ludicrous to send like just tons and tons of data, like spam the page as fast as possible. And yeah, I mean, React was pretty good at that, but I'm like, there was a whole bunch of things that I didn't picture React, being as good at potentially.
Mm.
Like there's no way that it was going to, if it's going to re-render everything. I know this is a very mechanical thing, but I just like, I'm like, there were other options out there before. And I like, even libraries like that had some reactivity like Vue that were coming out at the time were like, yeah, we got a VDOM where we got,
Mhm.
reactivity plus VDOM. And I'm just like, why VDOM? And
Mhm.
I was like, I felt like I needed to like do a sanity check. I
Yeah.
mean, I guess I started on the web too old, before React, before, the modern
Mhm.
thing. And I was just like, this is insane to me that, we can just like accept that this is the, only way. And yeah, so I made benchmarks. I did tests. I looked at every example. I tried to see if I could build a system that had, was performant and ergonomic and had all the things that I liked
Mhm.
from, using Knockout without, you know, some of the bad sides, knock out the good parts. But more than that, actually having learned from stuff from React, like unidirectional flow,
Mhm.
things that made apps more maintainable. I mean, you don't need React to hit these kind of problems when you're building apps. React was popular for like introducing things like Flux, like better data patterns.
Mhm.
But these best practices weren't, React's design helped support them, but they weren't always encoded into React. Like React did not ship a Flux module.
Right, right.
It was just like best practices. React was always about best practices, and I'm like, well, why can't we have best practices that fit around other paradigms? They just
Mhm.
have to be as well defined. React was really good at defining like sort of its rules or its mindset. It let you come in and be like, look, this is like, think immutable, think, functional, like think like this is how you want to approach the problem. Not everyone does when they approach React, but
Yeah.
the creators at least had an idea and a direction, which is different than the frameworks before, because the frameworks before were just like, look, the DOM updates,
Yeah.
fine.
Right.
They didn't
Right, right. Yeah.
care about, they were very mechanical, right? As
Mhm.
like any product evolution standpoint, it starts with some kind of technology, and then someone, makes the Apple product. They make
Yeah.
the iPhone, and they're like, look, you guys may have had a touchscreen before, but this is a touchscreen.
Yeah. Yeah.
React was kind
Mhm.
of like that for front end.
Mhm.
And immediately I was like, I mean, yeah, I get it, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it.
Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, I think this notion that like React kind of it feels like even in the early days, React was very much just the way in which it was kind of built, the way that it felt intuitive to interact with it, very much push developers into these patterns that I think made it easier to work on like larger teams that were collaborating on larger projects versus like going into every piece of your front end like, oh, someone worked on this component, the way in which they handle like state management and everything was vastly different than some other part of the app. And I think React kind of like smoothed that over. in a way that felt very nice.
Yeah, at least in theory. I mean, it's one of those interesting things because like Angular also sought to solve that problem,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and they did it by saying like, look, we have a library for everything. You want to do
Mhm.
this? Here's
Right.
a service. You want to do this? Here's a service. React wasn't quite as prescriptive in that sense, but they did
Mhm.
have at least a philosophy. They had a direction, and they're like,
Yeah.
which is more than what a lot of solutions had at the time. It's
Yeah.
kind of ironic now that when we step way further in the future.
Mhm.
Um, the fact that people did, React had almost fashion because like even though it had
Yeah.
guiding principles, best practices change, which is
Right.
good. This is what helps things evolve. That now when people look at React, they call it a mess, but it was actually it was very freeing at the time to be basically, have limits. I know that's kind of weird, but to actually be like, look, this is kind of like the rules. People wanted to be told what to do, and
Mhm.
it's as I said, it's very ironic that um, on one hand, React was like, this is how you do things. On the other hand, they were still flexible enough that best practices would continue to change over time.
Right. Right.
So it's a weird conflict. But on the other hand, I don't actually personally find it conflicting. That's like my favorite part about React, and it's the thing that I wanted to capture in Solid. It was part of actually that design philosophy really guided me in terms of focusing on primitives. Like React for React is the components,
Mhm.
but for me it was like, okay, let's make this about the signals or the reactive system,
Yeah.
and see how far we can take that, because then we have these guidelines and we have these building blocks that we can
Mhm.
actually continue to expand on top of in a predictable way.
I think that's well said. Yeah, the like, and yet like, I think that there was a lot of difficulty. Like Angular always felt. I think it was so regimented that was a lot of the pain that people felt working on those projects. And then React was like just unopinionated enough, or like it didn't really get in your way. I think it was also to your point of like new users ramping up. It was way easier to just like get some. You didn't have to understand like React. It was intuitive to look at. It was kind of DOM like, but then it pointed one in the right direction. So there was like, yeah, some guidance, but it wasn't as much. It wasn't this like kind of whole new API that one had to understand to write in it. So yeah, it's interesting to think of those as a spectrum. You mentioned that this kind of like moving away. I guess building with primitives maybe it was kind of more something that we've been talking about here in a couple of instances, and that was a lot of your motivation. Was there like why was this the thing that you felt was the missing piece? Like you mentioned the VDOM with Vue and like that kind of not really being the thing. Like, why was your big sell more like composability from the bottom up?
Yeah, I mean, Vue at the time actually had something called the options API, which was these
Yeah.
big objects. It's because everyone was scared of composition at this level.
Hmm.
Everyone was like, our state should look like plain objects.
Right.
Angular did it, and in their case, in a very fairly inefficient way, I should say. Like Zone.js, they just like wait for every single like event handler, async, anything that happened, and we're like, okay, did anything change after that?
Yeah.
Reacted a little bit different, where they had at least had like a set state where they're like, okay, this component owns the set state. When
Hmm.
you call set state and you update something, we'll rerun the component, right?
Yeah.
Um, and Vue was like, okay, we'll just make these big getter, like it's almost like a proxy, but we didn't have proxies back then. But
Yeah. Hmm.
basically, this big getter blob. And the thing I loved about Knockout was that you just made these like little like signal effect computer. You just like, I mean, to be fair, you could do this with Vue's objects, but they weren't quite as portable. Like in when I used Knockout, like basically a component was a function.
Hmm.
There was a whole other, it wasn't quite components like we know today, because the view was like in a separate module. Like they used to call this MVVM or something, model
Right.
view model
Yeah. 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 Mhm.
view. So it wasn't quite the same as a modern component, but effectively you started kind of building up this kind of ephemeral state
Mhm.
that was associated. Like there's the model that persists, and then there's the view that you update and see in the templating. But there was
Mhm.
this real kind of like middle ground ephemeral state in the view model, and
The view
which,
model. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is kind of like a component. It was like the
Mhm.
early ground. The difference is it's a separate tree than the view tree, where
Right.
components mix
Mhm.
view model and view together. But like it generally still had this kind of building of pieces, and we would just you know have a component as a function. and then like it state be functions, and then have functions call functions that wrap functions. Like it was
Mhm.
just like you
Yeah.
just compose it all up like a bunch of blocks, and then you'd be like, oh, I have this piece over here, I grab that and call it in here as a function. Like composition was like, we always see this now as like a basic example, like use local storage or whatever. But that kind of hook like composition existed in the knockout model, because it was very similar idea. You'd be like, oh, I have they call them observables, but basically a
Yeah.
signal. And then you'd
Mhm.
be like, oh, I want to signal the rights to local storage. Well, I'll just wrap that in a function and then create my own local storage signal. Like that kind of composableness had been in that model right from the beginning. And when I looked out at the JavaScript ecosystem,
Mhm.
it was not there. So there was a DX thing that I wanted. And then on
Yeah.
the other hand, conceptually, knowing that when I update this one thing, it updates this one other thing. There's no
Mhm.
re-render, no diffing, no none of that. It just all seemed like there's all these extra systems being built in that were all completely unnecessary. So
Right.
there's like, yeah, and as I said, I was kind of like, okay, well, maybe I just think this, maybe I'm crazy. But then like when I started seeing like, conference talks where people talking like the performance of React, I was like, okay, no, this doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
Like I need to vet it myself. And that's, how I got involved. And I just wanted to recapture that developer experience. And honestly, I wasn't alone. There was a few other people
Yeah.
working on very similar projects at that time. It was kind of funny because like, as I said, there was a DX element, there was a UX element, but it wasn't like, how does this look? It wasn't like an aesthetic thing necessarily.
Right.
It was a very mechanical
Yeah.
driven thing. We wanted, to make things, more efficient and easier to use from that perspective.
Mhm.
And the truth is, it wasn't a world that it seemed that people would be accepting of this, because, React had won. Like even back then, everyone knew,
Mhm.
and people just were like, yeah, I have my state that's plain objects, very important because plain objects aren't magical.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and and then I have my templating, or
Mhm.
whatever flavor I choose, and you know I just update it and it re-renders and I do the thing, like the whole VDOM spiel, like
Yeah.
that was where the world had gone to, and no one wanted these granular composable state primitives.
Which I think the impulse towards that like makes a lot of sense, and I think there's a reason it's been successful, right? It's like it's kind of it does away with a lot of that like wiring up, which I think historically had been very gross. Like it'd been very hard to handle and it'd been very error prone. Like you'd always get all these weird front end bugs, like, oh, I clicked the button and X didn't happen, and without something they're kind of orchestrating it, it was always hard. But
Yeah,
it
no,
sounds like your real thesis here is that like giving developers explicit control of those signals in a way that's easier for them to grasp and kind of wrangle, like that is really the place that you wanted to be. Like, would you say that that's kind
yeah,
of it?
definitely. I was not a junior developer anymore. I did have a team, but I had a team on a startup that had been using Knockout, so we were familiar with the technology. We understood signals, or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call that type of reactivity, fine grained reactivity at the
Hmm.
time. And we were so like I wasn't worried about ramp up or who was going to like learn it. I was just like, we have good technology to build good applications. It's isolated, it's modular, it gives you all these qualities that are really, really powerful when you want to build, decent size apps. You don't have to worry about everything getting entangled. We were never debugging why components are re-rendering down 10 trees. There are places
Hmm.
where you're like, oh, this thing updated more than I expected, but usually it was isolated and kind of like within its certain zone, because
Yeah.
when you're dealing with signals, you're dealing with a data graph. So
Right.
only dependencies talk to each other,
To one another. Yep. Yep. Yeah.
So it made a lot of sense from all the mechanical reasons. It just wasn't nice to look at.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and as I did more work on the benchmarks, it turned out I was like, no, this is actually really fast, like
Hmm.
insanely fast, like more like with a little bit of modern tooling. That's something Knockout never had.
Hmm.
We aren't just like more performant than say React, which is a popular solution. Popular solutions generally are going to be like, they're not focusing on performance. They got users to worry about.
Hmm.
We were like more performant than everything.
Yeah.
Like, like,
Mhm. Yeah.
like, I say we, but like there's a couple independent projects at the time. There's myself.
Mhm.
There's Adam who did Adam Hale. Sorry, he did Surplus.
Mm.
There's a couple other like these kind of like signals based things, and I like it just. This is what finally got me to open source it, because I was just like I want to play in the benchmarks. I just want to like prove it, like from an academic almost
Yeah.
standpoint, like just like, look, there is an alternative. I get it. It's not fashionable. I'm getting older now. Maybe I'm not fashionable. I don't care.
Yeah.
Senior dev. I just do what I like.
Mhm.
And I mean, I mentioned this in the article. Things might have stayed that way if it weren't for the fact that React, like, less than a year later, was like, we finally solved composition. Here's hooks.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Do you think, like, I guess it sounds like you probably didn't see that really coming, this big kind of inflection point in React. So did that surprise you a lot? And I guess were you expecting the amount of push into Solid that likely caused?
No, like I didn't see that coming at all. See, the thing you have to understand is React's like functional roots and its whole like almost like a video game thinking of like immediate mode. I don't know if everyone knows the difference, but there's like classically in graphics, there's like two different models. There's immediate mode and retained mode. Immediate mode, this idea that you can like re-render the whole scene graph every time. This is very common
Mhm.
in video games because it keeps a constant frame rate. It's basically the thing that powers everything. They just recreate the graph every time and redraw the game.
Yeah.
And it's great because it's predictable. You don't have to worry about weird artifacts happening over time. You just kind of slam it. There's a different model, the retain mode, where you actually keep something and you mutate it, where you just update only kind of what needs to change. And this is
Mhm.
understandably way more efficient, but it's less predictable because sometimes you change lots of things, sometimes you change a few things.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the DOM is retain mode. Like it
Yeah.
is,
Of
it is
course.
something that stays
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
like right off the bat, there's this mismatch between kind of like React mentality and like how the web platform works.
Mhm.
So like I was like, if we align ourselves more with the platform, we can do better stuff. And kind of sorry, where I'm going with this is you could just see this kind of two different mentalities. Like the separation exist in the ecosystem in general. React was like the very first to come in and be like, maybe not the very first, but like the first popular enough to come in and be like, no, we think retain mode is good. We can just re-render everything. And, sorry, not retain. Sorry. React
Yeah.
was the first to think immediate mode is good. We can just re-render everything. And this kind
Mhm.
of mentality carried out into its ecosystem in terms of what succeeded. There were a couple people who were working on signals or like fine-grained reactive libraries in React.
Mhm.
Uh, MobX, or Observable as it originally
Mhm.
was,
Mhm.
is a signals implementation as state management for React. Obviously, it didn't always quite gel perfectly, but it was a very good solution, way ahead of its time. Great technology, big inspiration for what I did with signals later, and but it never quite fit with like their mental model.
Mhm.
Instead, the biggest competitor on the state management side at the time was Redux,
Yeah.
which was you kind of like have this boilerplate. It was very simple in that like everything was functional driven and it was all
Mhm.
synchronous, and there was no like event emitter. There's just one store essentially,
Right. Right.
and Redux kind of became the poster child. I thought MobX was a way better solution, like way more powerful, way more capable, but like Redux fit React's philosophy and re-render model. And in fact, the guys who created Redux became members of the React core team. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
there was a definite like it's funny, after the original creators of React kind of moved on to different projects, it was actually like the Redux maintainers that actually
Mhm.
became React.
Yeah.
So like
Mhm.
there's a passing of the torch here, and that mentality preserved. So you have to understand like React was never going to go this direction, which is why it completely shocked me when I saw hooks, because hooks are not the same. And if you ask them about it, they'll tell you something about some functional programming thing
Yeah.
or whatnot, and
Mhm.
explaining, and they are mechanically different. In with hooks, your component reruns, and then and basically it checks the values and decides if the hooks rerun. Whereas like in the signals implementation, your components don't rerun, only the quote hooks rerun. So they are like opposites.
Yeah.
But they look almost identical. Like
Mhm.
there's no way you look at hooks and don't go, okay, these are like primitives. Like, React's whole like previous, like, oh, our state is just objects was out the window. Like
Yeah,
this
no,
is clear.
absolutely. Yeah.
Use state, use memo, use callback, use effect, use whatever.
Yep.
Like, and like you can tell they got to it from a different place. If you look at their like prior art when they released hooks, they don't mention signals, reactivity, anything like along that side. We were not influenced by that at all. But you look at it and you're like, come on, guys.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mhm.
But to be fair, they probably weren't.
They arrived at the same destination, probably, like, in a way, right? There's a very similar
Right.
feel to what these things are trying to do. Maybe by necessity, like, one could argue, but yeah, it's absolutely there, and it does feel like hooks is kind of a roundabout way of reaching this destination, and I think that's part of the reason I still think that like hooks are very tricky to grok like what's actually going on, what's with like what the framework works for new developers. Even like being a person that spent a lot of time in hooks, you're still like I find myself just like throwing console logs at the top of a hook to like, wait, when is this actually firing? Like it's always it feels very counterintuitive still.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in a lot of ways, like that was the argument they made against what they called key value observables, or essentially fine grained reactivity.
Yeah.
If you go watch a Pete Hunt talk or Tom Ochino or like Jordan Walk, any of the original React guys, and when they're not talking about Angular, they're talking about basically Ember or Knockout.
Yeah.
And when they're talking about like what's wrong with that, there's like this great talk where Pete Hunt went to university, I think, or college, they call it in the US here, and basically gave a talk on like selling React. And it was a little bit more technical. And he broke into like 3 ways where React was better than these other frameworks. And it was very specific about these kind of mechanical things, like in terms of like what happens about like state ownership and knowing what reruns and all. Like basically he broke it down. And I watched that video again about a year ago, and I was like pretending he was talking about modern React instead of Knockout, and the video fit perfectly. Like they basically reverse their whole positioning on this. Like if you ask them, they'll say they haven't, and it's still like fine because of some academic functional whatever. But like to be fair, as a layman developer looking at this and looking at like they're saying you could literally slot the hooks examples for the say Knockout examples, and you'd be like, yeah, I get what he's saying.
Yeah.
And so it was a big departure. I mean, in some ways it was necessary. It gave that composition. They needed something smaller than a component. React was all components, and they were like, okay, we actually need to compose something smaller than a component. How do we do this? And the way they solved it was basically saying, we'll make something that you can look smaller than a component, but it's still actually the component that's the level of granularity. It's still component based, but we're going to make something that looks smaller, right? Which is, I said, in contrast to like signals, where the small thing is actually the unit of change.
Yeah.
So I think both models make sense if you can get into them. It's just, I don't think either is actually simpler than the other anymore. I think early React, like class, lifecycle, render, redo, was dirt simple.
It was simple.
Yeah.
I don't think, it's really hard to argue otherwise.
But it's everything since then, especially into hooks, they wandered into a territory that is kind of similar to where these other solutions that they earlier condemned were. And for me, that was an opportunity. And not only me, but for like, I think Evan Yu or Rich Harris as well.
Yeah, right.
They announced hooks, and people are just like, and people are excited about them. And I think people kind of on the peripheral, on the outside, were like, wait a second, you guys made such a big fuss about plain data re-rendering, blah blah blah. And I mean, React has somehow set the fashion. People, I don't know what they're scared or they didn't believe. Like I was pessimistic, and somehow they were like, no, it's okay to have these kind of data primitives. Within a week, Rich is talking about Svelte 3. Like that's where the compiler idea and like using the dollar signs showed up right after the hooks thing. Evan Yu's like, oh, we're going to pull out our stuff into the composition API. Fortunate for me, Solid already was there. Like it wasn't a shift. This is what I had been building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that this kind of push was this is maybe not. I was going to say inevitable, but the place I want to get here is less than that. I'm more curious if you think that the fact that there's kind of this convergence, right? Like on this idea that we're talking around of like eventually at some point for performance, the developer has to dictate when things change and how data should flow when it does. Like the kind of signal idea, and giving that back to developers, which I think Hooks kind of also encapsulates manually one way or another. Do you think that that's like needs to be a more fundamental? Like, should that be a web primitive? Should the browser be doing that? Like, that just seems like we've all arrived at this conclusion.
I mean, that's where it does seem like it is today,
Yeah.
which is, interesting in its own right. I mean, the browsers had proposals for different types of change management being built in for years. So I'm always very hesitant, going to standards, trying to be careful there.
Yeah, of course.
But yes, it does seem like we are developing a language, and I do want to call it a language for reactivity. And this is not a language that I think we even invented. If you talk to somebody, I'm sure in the academic field, this language has existed for a while. We just kind of self-discovered it ourselves. But there is definitely a language. And I think for me, it was always important because I like control. I like, as things scale up, I need escape hatches. I feel like it's necessary, as senior dev to be able to, not go too far into my abstractions. You want to decide how much you buy into stuff, like how much, because at some point things will change. I think it's an even more interesting topic today because when we talk about designing a language for UI, you can't not think about AI and like LLMs and all that kind of stuff. So like maybe that alone makes it almost inevitable because we might have built it because I wanted more control, but I think the machine, so to speak, wants more control as well. And giving them, a primitive that's like one step up is a lot more powerful for them. Like you can argue that something like React is simple because of these constraints, and it just kind of reruns, and it makes it easier for things to understand it in a certain way, and just kind of. But it is not nearly as powerful. Like there's a difference between, a lot of times with frameworks, you want to restrict power because you give too much to the users, then they'll do bad stuff, the foot guns.
Yeah.
I think if we're going to a future where we're, building these, where we're maybe not building things, where, maybe AI or something building things, then having power is actually really important because it will empower it to build better stuff.
Yeah.
For me, it was always about empowering people because I've targeted people like myself, people who knew what they're doing, people who wanted to get the best, out of their tools.
Yeah.
But it's definitely interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to veer off into AI. There is a certain inevitability here, I think, that hopefully like it's always like a back and forth, right? Like primitives are an abstraction. It's about finding the right boundaries, right? Like initially you might make a really crude abstraction and be like, this is pretty good, and get you going. And then later you refine it. And when you refine it, you can get lower level. It's like the same process when, frameworks build something and then eventually gets into the browser. You kind of do something kind of basic and kind of works. And then hopefully by the time it gets into, standards, it's actually something that's well-defined and maybe even simpler or smaller piece, like something that's actually more extensible, something more adaptable.
Adaptable. I think adaptable is a great word. I don't think it's too far off the rails here in Notion, because I think you're right. Like I think it's hard for agents, like, whatever LLMs or whatever's operating on these things, to kind of be operating at the level that the frameworks and the meta frameworks are kind of ask the user to operate at. Like it's just like it's so hard to kind of have all of the context that a developer has. I think, or especially like someone that really understands the internals of the framework they're using. Like it's just that's not what we've seen with the agents thus far. So I think that is like an interesting notion. It does kind of beg one to compare, like a junior dev stepping into the space doesn't feel that different than an agent, right? It's like, okay, like these are kind of both like they're just looking at what's exposed in lots of examples online and trying to do the thing as best they can. So like there's an interesting kind of discussion one could have there, but I don't want to send us too far down down into the weeds here. So I guess yeah, just like kind of real quick, and then I want to kind of get to our little quick lightning round questions. But before we get there, do you think that in general this notion of devs? You said that kind of when we began talking that you were surprised at how much devs seem to be okay with the magic, right? Like, do you think that that is maybe like what's causing this pain, or like needing to understand the magic of hooks was kind of part of this problem, or like what is the thing that's driving devs to kind of have this collective understanding that there is like maybe I need to actually have control of my tools a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is you can always add another abstraction, right? You can always make things easier and then easier and easier, but then you restrict it. And at a certain point, you will break out of the abstraction, which means that my personal opinion is the bigger the gap is between the abstraction and the need of depth you need to get to the underlying system, the more complicated everything will feel. This is why React use effect is a problem. This is completely actually why that's the first time people realize how React works. And I think that as our tools get more complicated, generally the hope is that you don't need to peel the layers. Let's build a compiler on top of our framework to, not have to worry about this. And then they need less and less and less, and like auto memorization and all, like, and at a certain point, it's like, if that abstraction has no holes, then you're right. That will be easy and good to go, and maybe you won't need that knowledge. But I haven't found that to be the reality, which means that we are carrying this weight on us. And the only way to solve it is not to come up with another abstraction on top of the abstraction. It's to actually remove abstractions. Like go, okay, now that we understand this problem better, how do we change the model? Yes, we need abstractions, we need primitives, but how has our understanding allowed us to actually change the foundations? And that is key, because that's at a certain point, that's the only way you simplify. There's no, you have to take stuff away. You can't just keep on adding.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Well said. I think that's probably as good a point to wrap as any. Let's do some quick fire questions, and then we'll wrap properly. I think I have a hunch what some of the answers will be here, but we'll see if I'm right. What's a tech buzzword you wish would go away?
I mean, I don't know if I necessarily want to go away. The AI related stuff is just too much for me. Maybe I'm just not in the loop, but I think it's an exciting area in a certain sense. But for me, at least it doesn't impact me that much because I'm working on mechanical stuff. So it's this kind of thing that I just haven't. I'm just, I know it's funny to say, but it's just something that I don't spend that much time. It's only when I come on podcasts like here that I actually end up thinking about it all that much. So I don't know. I guess I anything that's like overhyped like that at the second. I guess specifically, I think vibe coding. I get it's good for prototyping, but it's at a certain point engineers need to engineer. So
Yeah. I'm yet to be convinced. I've seen like a couple little like very, very isolated examples of it happening, but I just can't. Like I don't know. I'm yet to be convinced as well. On vibe coding specifically, I think AI stuff's there. I'm here for the day when AI, like we aren't. It's not like advertised. It's just like, okay, this thing uses AI, but like as the user, you don't really need to know about it. It's just like how it's getting its thing done. But we'll see. That's neither here nor there. What's one idea you had about web dev in 2015 that you still believe today?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it almost this whole. It's the idea that like you do need to put control in people's hands to a certain degree. You don't need to know how to build your tool from scratch, but you at least need to understand what the abstraction is. So I think it's important that things aren't too magical. I think at the base you need to at least be able to have a good mental model of things. And that's what led me to build Solid. It was about transparency. It was like, what you see is what you get.
Mm.
And yeah, that hasn't changed in the last 10 years.
Gotcha. Nice, nice. What's the biggest myth about performance in front end frameworks?
Oh man, I mean, I don't know if it's the biggest, but this one bugs me enough, like because it's this idea that like by adding a technology, like say adding signals to something, suddenly it's faster. It's the same fallacy I was talking about earlier, well, but just
Mm.
adding more abstractions, adding more things that makes it faster. The reason signals frameworks are fast is because they remove something. Like if you have signals and you make that your core, then that's all it's doing. Then that can be really performant. But if you say mix your signals with your virtual DOM, well, you're probably taking on the overhead of the virtual DOM and the overhead of signals. You're kind of getting the worst of both worlds. Like just taking your React and jamming signals into it won't make React faster. It'll probably make it slower, most definitely. And that's why when people ask the React team if they're going to move to signals, I mean, no, they have a very clear path, and that path is exclusive to this. Like, sure, you can use it for state management, but it's not going to like improve React all of a sudden. There are architectural constraints. Not every feature is just something you can nail on and be like, now it's better.
Yeah, yeah, gotcha. Yep, I agree. I agree. Okay, this I'm gonna go slightly off script on this one. Can you think of a specific like either project or type of project wherein this kind of fine-grained reactivity is necessary and like virtual DOM and like diffing like this doesn't work?
Honestly, necessary? No. These technologies, I think there's benefits for ergonomics. I think there's benefits for performance, but I don't know if there's anything where it's like you need this, because the beautiful thing about the virtual DOM is it's like relatively good enough for most things. And the thing is, people were fine reloading web pages for a long time. I think that idea of like what the need is a sliding scale, and people's expectations will rise.
Mm-hmm.
There's places that obviously fine grained really excels, which is places where you're doing lots of minuscule data updates, things like large tables or dashboards or
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. I just I it's not a matter of you can or can't. Like I guess another really cool example is people using it for video games.
Yeah,
Like
games.
there's
That was going to be my point. Is just like really like up games with a ton of data flowing in and out.
Yeah, because one of the interesting things is we've seen a lot of, we have like a 3JS universal render port,
Mm.
like one of our custom renders in 3JS. And it's
Yeah.
like if you look at like the React solution, people actually have to opt out of the React state management. Like they use a whole different state library to actually do it performantly. You might still want to do that with Solid, but you don't have to. Like this, the signals are performant enough. You don't have to worry about like re-renders.
Mhm.
So it is actually works quite well. So I think like there are situations where it makes a lot of sense. I said there wasn't. Low memory devices are still a thing.
Mm.
We're very, very attractive on television devices. That's actually where some of our like bigger
Oh,
known
cool.
things like Universal NBC, like Solid's used on television apps. You might have used Peacock or something like that, like and like we had some interest even from Netflix in that zone. It wasn't a plug and play swap from React, so it wasn't as easy to make that
For them.
move
Yeah, yeah.
but for them. But like generally speaking, like there are places where it makes a lot of sense to have these qualities, but in a lot of places like it will be good enough.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, the games example is going to be mine exactly. I got a couple side projects where I'm very much hitting this. Just like, I've got a ton of data flowing in and out that's like changing really quickly, and I'm feeling it a little bit as I'm like dragging stuff and moving stuff around. I'm like, this is React. I'm fighting React here in a way I don't want to be. So I'm glad you called that one out. This is kind of a question more about you. What do you think is the hardest part of maintaining an open source project that most people aren't cognizant of?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Actually, I don't know if it's not actually that interesting. It's just there's a lot day to day. I mean, I don't know if people will come in and they'll see their issue or their thing that they care about. And the truth is, when you're open source, your work is always in public. So like there are so many different people you're catering to, and that you're directly talking to the public. There's no insulation in the
Yeah,
way. Like
yeah.
I've worked on product teams in companies, and there's customer success team or whatever. Like open source, your customer are the developers, and you're interacting with them directly. So like, I don't know if this is like a hidden thing, but it's just there is like a huge amount of just like bookkeeping in the sense of like not like money or anything, like just people and
Mm-hmm.
capabilities and projects. And I people generally only come in for their like narrow slice, so they don't see the breadth of it all. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to keep on track of it when you also want to build stuff, or you want to you know try new ideas
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot. So like it's just like so like you know sometimes you just get a issues. You always hear. I guess there's been more visibility on this recently, where you see open source maintainers kind of like respond back to rude people or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but it's just like there's those people on one extreme, but like there's everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
It's just these projects end up small, but they become massive. Like,
Yeah.
and it often without the infrastructure that you would find at like a funded company. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean that can make things difficult at times.
Yeah. 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 There's probably not a lot of open source product managers that are just like, okay, I'll do all of the product triaging and everything, and then like hand it off to the developers.
Any chance you can ask me the question you skipped over?
Oh yeah, of course. The sorry, hold on.
What's one thing fine grained reactivity can do that the virtual DOM
Yeah,
can't?
yeah. What's one thing fine grained reactivity can do that the virtual DOM just can't?
Yeah, it's funny. Normally, I wouldn't say like any technology can or can't do anything, because you can always work around it and find the escape hole.
Mm-hmm.
Like find ways to like make it work. So it's like in your project, I'm sure there's a way you can make it do what you want.
Yeah.
But there are benefits that people are only starting to realize right now, especially seeing fine grained rendering coming into stuff like Svelte 5 or Vue Vapor, and you can
Mm-hmm.
start seeing this community start kind of thinking about like how we approach things differently. And I think the thing that people don't understand is by writing your code this way, you are giving your application knowledge of how data flows through your app.
Mm.
And this is incredibly powerful because it does mean you can do things that just don't make sense or don't work in the virtual DOM. Like, for example, you can fetch some data somewhere in your app, and if that data errors out somewhere deep where it's being used, like say rendering, and you like hit an error boundary or something, well, if you retry the error boundary in a typical virtual DOM library, like I think this is why React doesn't have an error boundary component. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
know what to do. You have to kind of fix the error so that the next time it re-renders or whatever, it
Mm-hmm.
knows that it will be corrected. Otherwise, it's just going to error again.
Yeah.
But like with a fine grained system, because the data dependencies, you can be like, oh, let me retry what errored and trace the data graph all the way up to the data fetching, and be
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I'm just going to refetch what failed. Like, and this kind of power is incredible, right? So like you can picture you have some data fetching, and then as I said, lower down, you're like try render something with that data and it
Mm-hmm.
fails, and then you're just like, oh, I'm going to retry. Maybe the user has a button they can click. It can
Yeah.
self-heal essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because the program understands the graph. And this is this
Mm-hmm.
is this capability people are only starting to realize it's now getting built into applications because of SolidJS or Vue Vapor. Felt like when you start writing your code this way, you're going to be unlocking other capabilities like this. We've seen advantages to this, like in debugging. You can actually
Mm-hmm.
be like, oh, like visualize the graph, like and I'm looking forward to these kind of things working their way into more into like developer tools, like especially
Yeah.
like IDE support and stuff. Because like, what if like you can use the data dependency graph to know like when you edit code, what part of your application could be impacted.
Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Like what needs to reload, like what tests need to run, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
That could be very cool.
So for me, that is some huge benefit to using fine grained reactivity that you don't really get with the virtual DOM.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. I feel like that's as good a note to end on as any. Yeah, thank you for pulling that question out of me, and thank you for coming online and chatting with me, Ryan. It's been a pleasure as always, and I'm looking forward to next time.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, and I always have a lot of fun. This podcast is definitely one of my favorites. So
Awesome.
anytime you guys or I have something new to share, I will be back.
Nice. Happy to hear it. Thank you.